A little over 15 years ago, hard to believe it's been that long, KB and Joshua and myself moved to Elk City as I became pastor here at Antioch Christian Church. And let me say this. I love what I do. I do. I feel like this is what God has gifted me to do. I feel like it's what He's called me to do in one shape or another, in one form. But I'll say at the same time, it ain't always easy. There are times. There are times when I wonder why I do what I do. And I'll say this, my pastor friends that I talk to will probably reflect the same thing. That we all have those questions at different times. And it's not to complain. It is just let's acknowledge the fact. Okay? Now, with that being said, a lot of you know, and we came out here, like I said, in 2008. January of 2008, started here in 2013. Then we left and went to Clinton, where I became pastor at First Christian Church in Clinton. And we made friends there. To be honest, we have friends that I still consider friends to this day. Okay, I would also like to believe that there were, and I believe there were, some good things that happened for the kingdom of God. But at the same time, I will say that 2.5-year period was probably the darkest time that I have ever been in ministry. It was crushing, emotionally, physically, professionally, and most of all, spiritually. For not just for me, for my family, and there were times during that I wondered if I had made a huge wrong turn. Okay? And I don't mean just going to Clinton. I mean getting into the ministry in the first place. Okay? And honestly, I would love to tell you that I've never ever had those, never ever wondered that question again. But I would be lying to you if I were to say that. Okay? And the reason I think that we've all been there, though, at different times where we have found ourselves in a spot that we have wondered, how in the world did I get here? Have I made a wrong choice? Have I done the wrong thing? And so in those moments, we find ourselves what we call kind of a low place, a low point, whatever you want to call it. A lot of times we call them valleys. We also refer to them as our desert or wilderness experience. We kind of go through these. And today we're going to be kind of wrapping up. This is the last of our series, Dumb Things That Smart Christians Believe. Okay, and which I want to say two things. Number one, we're going to be wrapping up the series up here today. It's not going to stop because we did not exhaust all of the dumb things that smart Christians believe. Okay? This wasn't all of them. And so there are more. Okay? There are also things that people believe about Christians that are dumb. And so what we're actually going to do is on Wednesday nights, starting this Wednesday at 6 o'clock, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to kind of continue this series with some of the dumb things that smart Christians believe, as well as some of the things that people believe about Christians that are dumb, and we're going to have a discussion about those, a biblical discussion. So it's going to start at 6 o'clock Wednesday night. Would love for you to be here. Going to be a real kind of a discussion-based and then digging into the Bible, so that's what we're going to be doing. But I want to jump into our last one for today, which is the belief that a valley means a wrong turn. Okay? And so kind of where, does this thought come from? I think where it comes from is that most of the time we look at things and we call them a mountaintop experience, okay? Mountaintop experiences are always great. Isn't that what we want? It's what we aspire to. It is when we have reached the goal, we've overcome the obstacles, we've reached the pinnacle of success. I mean, it's what we're all after. And so therefore, the opposite of the mountaintop has got to be the thing at the bottom, which is the valley. Okay, and if it's the opposite of the mountaintop, then it must be a negative. And since we know that negatives are always bad, then that means that the valleys are bad. And if we are there in the valley, it must be because we did something bad. We made a wrong turn. We made a wrong choice. And so as a result, we've kind of developed this attitude that if we find ourselves in a valley, that it means that we've made a wrong turn. We've made a wrong choice. Because what do we know? We know that God only leads us to the mountaintop, right? Wrong! No. And I think that's where we have gotten a lot of this. This is why it can be so dangerous in our faith and in our church, because we've come to believe that it's that if we're not at the mountaintop, that somehow we're just not living God's will. We're just not doing what he wanted, because that's the only thing that he would ever want for us. And so I want to kind of, dig into this a little bit. There's a couple of, I think, questions. So first thing is, if I'm in a valley, does it mean that I took a wrong turn? And the answer is sometimes. I know it's not the answer you were looking for. You're kind of like, no, I needed that. Never. Sometimes it is. And we're going to kind of come back to that a little bit later. But I think one of the questions that we need to kind of ask is, I think the key, if we want to know if the valley that we are in is the result of a wrong turn, we need to ask the question first of, and that is, how did I end up in this valley? Okay? How did I end up where I am? And, there's no two valleys are the same. Okay? No two wilderness experiences are the same. There's some of them that as soon as we're into them, we can see the end in sight. There's some that we see no end in sight, and we think that they're just going to plague us forever. Okay? There are some that are self-inflicted. That we brought them about on our own. Sometimes the valleys we're in are the consequences of living in a fallen and a corrupted world. Sometimes the valleys that we find ourselves in are because they are bearing out God's will. But we don't know that at the time. In fact, we may not know that even when it is over. And so, that's where I think that it is important that we ask, how did I end up in this valley? And as we get into it, I think that there's really kind of three options, okay? There are three ways. How did I end up here? First is God sent me here. Some of these valleys they are ones that God has led us into, whether it's a difficult situation, whether it's a tough decision that we have to make, no matter what it is. If you look back at Exodus, particularly in chapter 14, kind of like verses 1 through 4, what we find is that the Israelites have left Egypt. And so they're out of Egypt, and away they go. And then we come to this point where then God tells Moses as he's leaving, he says, okay, now I need you to turn around, make a U-turn, and you're going to go back and you're going to camp at a spot, which honestly, for a group of people that are fleeing slavery, it is not a strategically sound position. Okay? But that's where they end up. Now, at the same time, he tells them to camp there, and then we know that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh says, I'm going to go get them. And so he loads up and off he goes. And so all of a sudden we find that God has led his people and Moses, that they're here in this place where they are trapped in between the sea, the desert, and a bloodthirsty king. Okay? And what we know is that then they turn on Moses. Then they turn on Moses and they're like, oh my goodness, not enough graves in Egypt. Brought us out here so we could be killed in the wilderness. And so at that moment, though, what we see is that God has led them here, and only if they were there was their escape, their deliverance, through the parting of the Red Sea possible and necessary. Okay? And so when they are there, that's this whole leading 2 million men, women, and children through the sea, finding them in that spot. If they are not there, if they are not where God sent them, then they do not get delivered in the same way. And so, there's a thing that we've read that the will of God, because we know this in hindsight, but looking at that story, the will of God will never lead you where the grace of God cannot keep you. Okay? We know that in hindsight, but I'll guarantee you when they were sitting there, deliverance through the parting of the Red Sea did not look like an option. But that was exactly what God had planned. And so sometimes the valleys that we find ourselves in, we're there because God led us there. And we need to be reminded that the will of God will never lead you to where the grace of God cannot keep you. Okay? The second reason we end up in some of the valleys, I messed up. Sometimes the valleys we find ourselves in, they are our fault. Sometimes it's something small. Sometimes it, seemingly insignificant. Sometimes it is something big. It's a big wrong choice that we make. And there's a great example of this that we find in the same way. When the Jews were exiled, they are exiled out. They are dominated. We read all throughout this by foreign lands. And why? It was because of their decision, the fact that they would not move away from idolatry. They kept going back to it. And so here you have a group of people that made but they made bad decisions. And because of those bad decisions, they ended up in these valleys, in this valley to where they were exiled, to where they were conquered and dominated by other lands. Now, I do want to say this, not always when we messed up is it a sin problem. Because sometimes we see it, we're like, oh, well, it's a sin. No, sometimes we just make a wrong choice. Maybe we buy something that we shouldn't, or we say something that we shouldn't, or we find ourselves just on the wrong side, of an issue. We allow a relationship issue or something, to fester. And there's a lot of things that can happen that aren't necessarily a sin issue, okay? And there's a lot of options, but the fact is that because of our wrong choice, because of something that we did, this is why we find ourselves in this spot. The third option, sometimes it's because God sent me here, sometimes because I messed up, sometimes who knows? We chuckle about that, but sometimes we don't know. Okay? And honestly, the poster child for this is Job. Think about it. Here is Job, who is a righteous man, who is a good man. Job's life is just humming along, and then all of a sudden, in one day, he has this horrible run of bad luck, or so it would seem. And he loses everything. He loses his livestock. He loses his wealth. He loses his children. And then as if that's not enough, he wakes up and he's covered with painful sores from head to toe. And Job didn't get it. He didn't know why. His wife had no clue why. His friends certainly did not get it. Though they had all kinds of reasons. They could tell him all kinds of things, but they didn't get it. And then at the end of Job, what happens? God shows up. But go back and read it, because one thing that God never does? God never tells Job why it happened. God never told Job about the conversations that happened around the throne. The only reason we know about them is because they were recorded at the beginning of the book for our benefit. Okay? So in other words, we kind of got to peek behind the curtain. Job didn't know. But he went through it. Okay? And so, I think sometimes when we start talking about, why we find ourselves in the situations that we are, we don't know. And we may never know, no matter how hard we try to figure out what it was. There may be some times that we don't know. We just know that we're in the valley. And so, and what we know is that we may be in the valley because God sent me there. We may be there because I sent myself there. I messed up. It may be something. I don't know. We don't know why it is. I just know that I'm in it. And so the question then that we have to ask is, if that is the case, how do we respond? Once we know that, how did I get in this valley? The next question is, how should I respond now that I'm in this valley? And I think one of the first things is to remember that when you find yourself there, the enemy is always going to provide, he's always going to offer a shortcut. You think about Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, and Satan appealed to Jesus' mortal, his earthly flesh is what he appealed to. But every one of the temptations that he offered to Jesus was a shortcut. Okay? It was an easy, and he does the same thing for us. It's no different. Sometimes it's a complete distortion of God's word. Sometimes it's just something that looks good, that is appealing. Maybe it's he's going to provide an easy way out of a situation, or he is going to provide a way to just make it all go away. It may be a case that, then something that appeals to us, that, we find ourselves in a valley and he's like, well, you just need to fight fire with fire. By golly, you need, and so he always offers this shortcut to deal with whatever is that we're finding ourselves in. But I think one of the things to understand is that the enemy's shortcuts will never bring about the results that God desires. The shortcuts that he offers will never bring about the results that God desires. So, the second is that sometimes we need to realize that the messes we're in are self-made, and therefore we need to accept the consequences. Okay? Sometimes we need to just accept the consequences. Hebrews 12, in verse 5, he says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons, for what son is not disciplined by his father?" I know discipline is not something that we look forward to. It is not something that we enjoy, but the truth is that our Heavenly Father does discipline us. If there were never any consequences to our actions, we would never learn from the wrong choices that we make. But understand this, there is also a big difference between punishment and discipline. Okay? Punishment is intended to inflict pain. It is intended to beat down. Discipline is not. Discipline is about correction. Discipline is about learning consequences. And some of us, we have a hard time with this. It may be because of the way that we were brought up and what punishment and discipline was. It may be because of the way that we punish and discipline our kids. And so as a result, just because of what we are, it's hard for us to understand that. We start to see it. I hope and pray every single parent out here, every single grandparent out here, everybody that ever thought about being a parent out here, I hope and pray that when you discipline your children, it is done in a desire to correct them, to build them, to better them, not to hurt them, to teach them a lesson. We use that word, but it really, what is it? I'm going to teach you a lesson is I'm going to make you so miserable for what you did. I hope that that's not the way that you see it when you go to discipline your children. Because if it is, that may be why you see God's discipline as punishment rather than correction. And I think it's where, we see it that way. And we need to understand that sometimes we have to accept the consequences for the decisions that we have made, knowing that God's desire is to teach us, is to correct us, But ultimately, it is always to draw us back to Him, to a deeper relationship with Him. Okay? So, the other thing is, that I think when we realize that we need to accept the consequences, sometimes we find ourselves in a valley, and the first thing that we want to do, especially if we believe that this is something that maybe God has led us into, is we want to run away. And I'm going to say that should be your response. Don't run. Think of Jonah. Jonah may have seen being sent to Nineveh as punishment, as something, God had given him this. He didn't like it. It was obviously it was a valley to him because it was not something that he wanted to do, but God was going to make him do it. And what did he do? He ran. And so where do we find Jonah next? We find him thrown out of the ship and swallowed. He's in the belly of the fish, and then he's in fish puke on the beach. I mean, it's kind of, don't run. And I think that's, I know that a lot of times we don't feel like, it's like, well, I got to get out of here. But many times the fact is that God's calling us to go through something. And He wants us to go through it, especially when we feel like He has led us here. We need to follow through and stick to it. Because what we know is that in all things, even in those bad things, God is working to bring about good in our lives and in the lives of others. Okay? And so don't run from it when you feel like God is leading you there, because you don't know what He's going to teach you. You don't know how He's going to help you. And so here's a couple things. When we find them, I want to these are bullet points, okay, of things that we need to do. We talk about how we should respond. The first one is do the right thing. It is very tempting when we find ourselves in difficult situations to want to color outside the lines. Okay, to bend the rules a little bit, to do things in a way that benefits us, that makes it easier on us. That's what we talk about of taking the shortcut. But here's the deal, guys. As Christians, we are called to do what? To do the right thing. Number 2, tell the truth, even when it ain't easy. Even when lying would make it easier to handle the situation, to get through the situation. For the Christian, it is not enough to say that honesty is always the best policy. Honesty is the only policy. We need to be truthful and honest. The third one is to keep commitments. One of our first responses whenever we find ourselves in valleys is we want to kind of retreat, into ourselves. But the fact is that even in the valleys, life continues. Okay? Life goes on, and so whether it is your family, whether it's your church, whether it's your work, whether it's, your friends, they still need you, okay? And so keep commitments. Number 4, show concern for others. The fact is that our actions never impact just us. There's not a single one of us that lives in a vacuum. There's not a single one of us whose actions don't impact others around us. And I know that it's tough when we're going through a valley to think about others, okay? But the truth is that in those tough times, Christians are called to have a concern for others. We are called to think about how our actions, our words, how they impact and affect others. And you can have... And here's kind of, this really rolls into it, but the last one is not only having a concern for others, to show concern for God's reputation. And we're like, well, how in the world can I hurt God's reputation? Well, you can't, because God is God, but here's what you can do, is that you can have a negative impact upon the way that others see God. You don't change Him, you don't change His nature, but you can have a negative impact upon how others see Jesus and the way that they respond to Him based upon the way that we respond when we find ourselves in these valleys. And that's why Philippians 1:27, he says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Not whenever good things happen, But whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Truth is that we all go through valleys. We're all going to. But if we automatically view them as, if we automatically view them as the result of a wrong turn, we will never step out in faith when we are given the opportunity. Why? Because then this goes back to the whole blueprint and game plan. It's because, well, what if I make a wrong choice? If you think you're in a valley because of a wrong turn, then there's a real fear to step out in faith in the middle of that when an opportunity comes. Because why? What if I choose wrong? What if I make the wrong decision? And so we don't. I also think that, in the same way, whenever we run from all of the valleys and we're convinced that God must not be in it, we will never experience the amazing power of His deliverance. Let's be honest, we've all heard it, a miracle needs a mess. Okay? A miracle needs a mess. You don't have the parting of the Red Sea if you're not camped in an impossible situation. And so, now sometimes, this is not to say that every bad thing is a good thing, because no, some bad things are bad things. Just as the way it is. Okay? But there's a silver lining in all this. I love it. Wayne Phillips wrote a poem that he gave to me many years back, and it's called Mountaintops. And I actually printed, there's copies on the table on the way out if you'd like to take one. And I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but I would love to have you listen to the last stanza. He says, mountaintops are beautiful, but you must beware. As beautiful as they are, nothing grows there. Valleys are where we grow if we're willing to learn. James 1, verse 2 and 4 says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. There are always lessons to be learned in any of our valleys. And when James talks about trials of many kinds, what he's saying is it's not just one. Okay? If you're an athlete and you're trying to develop endurance, it doesn't happen from one workout. It happens from multiple workouts. And so as we go through trials, we need to understand that that's how we develop endurance and perseverance. But then he says what? Consider it pure joy, my brothers. That is not in a masochistic sense that we need to take joy, in pain and everything else, but in a sense of a proper attitude. Okay, the fruit of the Spirit. The Bible tells us the fruit of the Spirit is what? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Okay, and when we go into these valleys with an attitude of love and of joy, of peace, gentleness, faithfulness, okay, kindness, self-control, we go in with the right attitude. And when we go in with the right attitude into those trials, then that is when we will learn something from them. That's when we will grow from them. Guys, I look back on the valleys that I found myself in over the last 15 plus years, and I can go back further than that, but I can go back in the last 15 plus years, and I can see now how I grew out of those. I look back, at the time that we were in Clinton, and I see how I grew, and I learned from those things. And it's changed in many ways. It's changed a lot of the ways that I do ministry. It's changed the way that I see things. It's changed the way that I deal with certain situations and people. It's my focus in a lot of ways, and I am by no means perfect in it. I'm learning all the time, and I'm still going through the valleys and coming out. And that's what we're going to do. But if we're not willing to look at it and try to learn something from it, then they accomplish no good. Okay? And here's the thing that I want you to understand out of all this. Because the Apostle Paul, he writes in 2 Corinthians, and he talks about, a valley that he himself was in. And, in this valley, he's talking about that there was a thorn in his flesh that was placed there by the Lord. And he asked 3 times, not once, not twice, 3 times for God to remove it. And what did God say? No. No. But Jesus said, because my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And maybe you could, and not, I know that we're not to add to the Bible, and I'm not, but I'm just, if you put a parentheses, my grace is sufficient for you, go back. Oh, it's up there. For my power is made perfect in your weakness. See, it's in our weakness that God's power is seen. And so what does Paul say? Paul, he doesn't just leave it there. What's his response? He says, well, therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. He says, that is why, for Christ's sake, I will delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The thing is that when we start to look at any kind of a valley in our life as being the result of a wrong turn, we miss this. We miss this opportunity completely. Because we don't boast in our weakness. Why? Because I failed. We don't boast in the fact that we can't do this. Guys, I will say this. God's goal in taking you through, I know we talked about physical training. You and I, we go to the gym, we run, we do whatever, and what's the goal? We want to make ourselves better. Okay, we want to increase our endurance. We want to do all of these things so that we can handle stress and problems or altitude or heat or what, all of these things. We want to be able to handle them better. And I'm going to tell you, God does not send us into valleys. He doesn't lead us in there so that we can learn how to handle stress better. He doesn't lead us in there so that we can learn how to handle problems better, so that we can learn how to handle difficulties better. No, He does it so that we can learn how to allow Him to handle those better for us. That we can allow Him to take control, so that when we are in distress, when we are overwhelmed, when we do find ourselves someplace that we cannot do it, that we are weak, that we know there's nothing we can do about it, we know the first place to turn. Why? Because the last valley I was in, He walked through with me and He brought me out the other side. The last time that I was in a dark place, it was His hand that reached down and said, I know you can't come out of it, but I'm pulling you out right now. See, that's what those valleys are about. And when we think that they're the result of a wrong turn, when we think it's because we made a bad decision or we made a wrong choice, we miss the opportunity for God to deliver us out of it because we make it about us rather than Him. Yeah, you may be in a bad place because you made a bad decision, but that doesn't mean that a great God can't turn it into an amazing miracle, an amazing testimony. And the good news of all of this is for any of you that are sitting here today, if you're a believer, He has promised that He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. No matter what the valley is, He walks right there with you every step of the way. What a promise that is. Now, the other side of that is if you're here today and you're not a believer, you don't have that promise. And valleys get dark. And they get tough. But the promise you do have is that if you will turn to Him and ask Him to walk through it with you, He'll be there. That if you will give Him control, if you will let Him lead the way and give Him your life, He will grab your hand. He will walk through it with you. He will carry you through it. I think of the old poem Footprints. About the guy that looks back at his life, and says, the darkest times of my life, there's only one set of footprints. He says, why'd you leave me? What's he say? He goes, no, you don't understand. I didn't leave you. Those are the times that I carried you. I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to have our time of decision. If you're in a valley right now, if you find yourself in a desert, in a wilderness experience right now, please be reminded that you are never, ever alone. Not just the fact that Jesus walks with you everywhere you go, but we as a body of believers want to be with you as well. That's what the church is about.